Today, let's study about the electrolysis. So, electrolysis is, let's have the definition of electrolysis first. So, electrolysis is a process of decomposing an electrolyte when a direct current is passed through it. So, here comes a first terminology for us. What are electrolyte? Let's move on to the next slide and see the terminologies related to the process of electrolysis before we actually understand how the electrolysis take place. So here are some of the terminologies which are related to the process of electrolysis. Now, first of all, we have the terminology that is basically your electrolyte. So electrolyte are your ionic compounds. These are your ionic compounds. Now, ionic compounds are made up of ions. They are made up of ions, right? Now, some of the example of ionic compounds are the salts, like sodium chloride, like copper sulfate. So these are the examples of ionic compound. They are made up of ions. They are made up of sodium ions, chloride ions. Similarly, this is made up of copper ions and the sulfate ions. Now, apart from the soluble salts, there are acids and there are alkalis, which are also the examples of an electrolyte. So electrolyte can be your ionic compound, it can be an acid, or it can be an alkali. Now here we have the example of sodium chloride as an electrolyte. So we have a sodium ion here and we have the chloride ion here, right? So until and unless we are going to connect it with the direct supply, the DC current, these ions which are part of this electrolyte, now they will be wandering around, they will be moving randomly all around this particular electrolyte. Now they will be moving in one direction, they'll be aligning themselves in a particular direction only when we are going to connect it to a DC supply. This is my DC supply, right? If we don't have this DC supply, then these ions are wandering around in this electrolyte. Now, after this, we move on to the next terminology. That is basically electrodes. Now, this particular terminology, electrodes, what do we mean by the term electrodes? Electrodes means they are the conductors. Okay, they are your conductors. Conductors means they are either made up of metals or they are made up of substances which can conduct electricity. Apart from metals, we have another substance which we are very much aware of, and that is graphite. Graphite is a form of a carbon. So these substances over here, we have the conductors, right? So these are my conductor. This is one conductor, this is another conductor, and we commonly call them electrodes. Now, these electrodes are of two type. Number one, we call them cathode, and another one is known as anode. So why do we call them cathode and anode? We call them cathode, the electrode towards which the cations are attracted, right? Toward which the cations, that means the positively charged ions attracted are known as cathode. And the electrode towards which the anions are attracted, we call them anode. Anions are basically your negatively charged, right? So these are basically the chloride ions or your anions, and the positively charged sodium ions are known are your cations. So anions will be attracted towards an oppositely charged plate or an electrode, which is basically attached to the positive terminal of the battery. So that is why, because anions are attracted toward it, so we call it an anode, which is actually attached to the positive terminal of the battery. Similarly, the cations are attracted towards the cathode, which is attached to the negative terminal of the battery. So that is a negatively charged plate and we call it a cathode. Now let's see what happens once till the time we have not connected the electrode with a DC supply, the ions are randomly moving. But as soon as we have connected them to a DC supply, now these ions are moving in a particular direction. The anions are moving towards the anode, and the cations, they are moving toward the cathode, right? So first of all, let's see what happens to the anions. Now, as soon as the anions are attracted towards the anode, what happens here? The anions, they will be losing the electrons, right? They'll be losing the electrons and they'll be forming an atom. And if we write on this side the electron loss, so we'll be putting it up with the positive sign. Now we know that in nature, the chlorine exists in the diatomic form, that's Cl2. So basically the two chloride ions, they will be losing, they'll be giving two chlorine atoms, which will combine to form a molecule of a chlorine, and it will be giving two electrons. Now these two electrons, what happens? They travel to an external circuit. And this is my external circuit. This is an external circuit of my wires, which are connecting the two electrode with the DC supply. So what is happening? These electrons which are being lost on the anode, they are traveling through an external circuit toward the cathode. Now, what happens here? The cation which are which are deficient of an electron, now these cations are going to acquire, these cations will be accepting these electrons. These cations will be accepting these electrons. That is the Na ions, these electrons which are traveling toward the cathode, they'll be accepting these electrons to form the sodium metal. Right? Now remember, the number of electrons lost should be same as number of electron gain. So here we have two electrons which have been acquired by sodium. So two sodium ion will be acquiring two electrons to form two sodium atom. Now these two sodium atoms, whatever the sodium atoms will be discharged at the cathode, they are going to deposit the sodium cathode. They will be plating the sodium cathode. And the chlorine gas, which is evolved at the anode, will be liberated in the gaseous state. So basically, we can see it over here that the NaCl, which was in my molten form, which was a molten electrolyte, is now decomposed in the form of a sodium metal, which is plating the cathode, and it is giving the chlorine gas at the anode. So this is what the terminology electrolysis means. Electrolysis means that means that the decomposition of an electrolyte when a DC current is passed through it into its component. So this is how the whole process of electrolysis take place. So basically, an electrolytic cell in which the electrolysis take place comprises of two components, the basic two components, or you can say three components. Number one, the most importantly, jiska decomposition hota hai, that's an electrolyte, right? Which is an ionic compound. And then the DC current need to be passed into an electrolyte for its decomposition. That is done by the electrode. And then we need to have a DC supply itself. That's a battery, which is then connected with an external circuit. So these are the component of an electrolytic cell: an electrolyte, an electrode, the DC supply, and the external circuit. So this is the simplest form of an electrolytic cell in which the electrolysis of molten sodium chloride take place. Now we will be doing some more complicated, complex scenarios in my upcoming video. So do watch that video in order to get the better concept of some complicated scenarios. Thank you.